In August, my boyfriend and I were struggling to carry a TV inside. My neighbor noticed and offered to help. He seemed like an odd guy, but not in a concerning way at that point. He would start conversations with us every time we were on our balcony, which felt weird. He is 30 years older than me and lives in my apartment complex. It escalated to trying to talk to me every time he saw me in my balcony glass door, even with the door shut. I often sit there and this weirded me out, but I usually just waved and stayed inside. He'd stand there for a minute or so staring into my apartment as if I would come outside and eventually would move on. He has told us he recognizes our cars and has made comments about damage he hadn't noticed before. I don't mind he noticed damage to my car, but why ask people you barely know? And why was he assuming after a week of seeing my car that he'd know the dents well? Again, weird. I work at a dispensary and I use MMG, and he's a regular customer. He knows I work there now, but I don't do transactions with him and avoided him at work before this. My coworkers say they seen him out with young girls, and he generally doesn't act like someone in their 50s. I know there's a lot of definitions of how a 50-year-old should act, but his behavior was juvenile. I live on the 3rd floor, but the parking lot is level with the 2nd floor and is angled in a way that headlights sometimes flash into our windows before driving off, depending on the spot. I have severe CPTSD, and I was diagnosed a month before this incident, and I'm concerned I'm overreacting as a result of my issues. I do have a therapist, but my attempts at coping mechanisms for this incident have failed so far. I had nightmares about this guy prior to this, and they were very similar to what happened. It creeps me out. In January, I had a really creepy interaction with my neighbor, and despite being told by several people that I have ample reason to fear this guy, I still feel like I'm being unreasonable. I was alone in my apartment. My boyfriend had been out of town a lot and was working a lot, and I think the neighbor noticed his car was missing. I don't know if he saw this as an opportunity to talk to me or what, but he had been trying to interact with me from my balcony a lot when my boyfriend wasn't home. I had been home from work for about 20-30 minutes. I hear knocking on the door. I leave it alone since I never answer unless I know someone's coming over. I'm 21, female, and disabled, and I don't feel safe opening the door for random people when I'm unable to physically protect myself. Repeatedly knocking, yelling, "It's his name," and other things I didn't hear well. I was watching TV and had my laptop out at the same time, so this isn't an exaggeration. He stood there knocking for at least 5 minutes. I didn't check the time until it seemed like he'd been knocking for too long, so it's likely a few minutes longer than that. I checked the door at one point to see who it was because I was pissed off at the knocking and got curious, but otherwise, I was not willing to open that door and stayed silent, other than my TV since it was already on. The knocking stops eventually, and I thought that was the end of it, but a few minutes later, he was in the parking lot with the fishing pole, jumping up and down to get my attention, screaming my name saying it's him. It was about 7 p.m. at this point. He had already seen me in my balcony window, so I walked outside feeling like I had no other choice and hoped to defuse the situation. Then he says, "Hey, I was knocking at your door, but you never answered." I started to get very uncomfortable and was a bit intimidated. Then he said, "Well, I was just trying to see if you wanted to hang out, smoke, and have a chat. I don't mean to bother you if you don't want to." He was acting weird, couldn't stay still, and was looking around a lot. I can't describe the way he was moving. The closest comparison I can make is either someone on drugs or a small child who's anxious and can't stand still. I'm assuming he had drugs in his system other than marijuana, or maybe he hadn't been taking meds he should be taking. Who knows? But I'm not about to get stoned and hang out with a 50-year-old man I barely know. I responded, very uncomfortably, "Sorry, I don't have anything to smoke with you. I just have my capsules." He said, "I have some stuff we can smoke, it's fine." No, I legally can't do that. I have MMG and cannot do that under state law and breaks my company policy, and worst of all, breaks HIPAA. I'm not willing to lose my job over this guy. I wish I just said that looking back, but I didn't want him to know where I work, since I successfully avoided him up to this point. So I said, "Maybe in 30 minutes or so. I'm pretty busy right now." I know this wasn't the best response, but I was planning on letting him know I wouldn't be hanging out with him once he came back, so I was okay leaving it at that. I also hope he realized he was being weird. He left for 2.5 hours. In that time, I developed a migraine, I started vomiting and shit myself. Not his fault. This is a fairly common thing for me, but I couldn't deal with him and that crap. At around 9, I went to bed, turning off every single light, hoping to get the message that I was not going to be out in any capacity. At around 9:45, right before our complex has quiet time at 10, he came back, and even though I wasn't checking the time, he was clearly more persistent, and despite not answering, he continued to knock for what felt like much longer time than before. He left right before curfew, but until then, he was yelling pretty loudly for me to answer. "It's just me, open up, it's his name," etc. I had my door locked, so I felt safe enough, but I was still scared. If I hadn't been having these health issues, I would have just said through the door, "Sorry, I can't smoke with you," and leave it at that. But I was shitting myself with a migraine, vomiting while this man screamed at my door. I didn't want to deal with it. Once he stopped knocking, he went to his car, moved from a spot that you can't see my bedroom from, to a spot directly in front of my bedroom window, and started flashing his brights into my apartment, and probably all the neighbors. After that, I couldn't sleep. I was scared. He was incredibly persistent to a concerning degree. I was too scared to go to the bathroom when I had to vomit because my blinds were open, and I just wanted to disappear. I didn't want him to know what I was up to, even if it was a health issue, so I just stayed in bed as long as I could. I eventually went to the bathroom, and when I came back to my room, he was staring right at me from his car. I don't think he was smoking or anything. He seemed to just be sitting angrily. I just froze. Then eventually I went back to bed. Since then, he stares into my apartment angrily, gives me strange looks when I see him at work, and parks in front of my apartment every single time there's a spot open. He used to park in the same spot religiously every single day that's not a view of my apartment until this incident. His actions all feel intentional, but I'm scared I'm overanalyzing the situation. I know this is not normal behavior at all, but I feel like I'm assuming the worst when I don't need to. People have told me it's not my job to teach him how to behave like a regular person, and I know they're right, but I'm scared I'm blowing this out of proportion and fear a neighbor that was in poor attempt trying to be kind. I feel traumatized, but I also feel like I shouldn't feel that way. I'm scared he was generally trying to be kind in a shitty way, and I'm just being an asshole. I'm not sure exactly how old I was at the time, but I would guess about 5 years old. My dad took me to the park while he was playing on a local casual baseball team. I was left alone at the playground. A man approached me. Somehow, despite being so young, I noticed there was something off about him. He was very talkative and friendly. I didn't mind his company. However, he continually asked me if I had to use the bathroom. There was a public restroom at the park. At one point, he said he had to use the bathroom, and he retreated into the woods. When he returned, he continued to talk to me and intermediately kept asking if I had to use the bathroom. Finally, my dad's game ended, and he approached us. The disturbing part was, my dad didn't seem fazed by this stranger hanging out beside his young daughter. The man was polite, and at one point, he asked us when we would return. To this day, my dad doesn't recall this incident or seem aware of how close I could have been to being potentially kidnapped and sexually abused. This memory has never faded from my mind. It's an unsettling realization of how I could have experienced a horrible trauma and how naive and oblivious my dad was at the time. This happened back when I was in college. It was back before there were cell phones or the internet. My college was located up in the mountains, with only a small town situated beside the main campus. While it was a very good technical school, the curriculum was very demanding, so there was a high dropout rate. Therefore, the partying could be quite intense to release some of the pressure. There was one fraternity. I knew a lot of the brothers since we had attended the same high school. To be honest, I didn't like any of them. It always felt to me like fraternities were a place to buy your friends and be popular. This particular frat liked to throw a big party in their basement every Saturday night during the winter season. Some of my real friends enjoy these parties, so I take them, kind of acting like an escort. It is important to note, this frat had a reputation for acting like militant fascists at times, so you had to be careful how you handled them when things got tense. Of course, I knew many of them, so it was a bit easier for me at the time. I remember one particular Saturday night evening. a nice-looking girl came up and asked me for a light. She wanted to smoke a cigarette. I obliged her, and she stood there by the bar, smoking openly in front of everybody. Sometime a little later, after she had finished her smoke, some dude came up to the bar and lit up a smoke. Immediately, a bunch of frat brothers surrounded him, asking if he had asked permission. He put out a cigarette and apologized, but I could see the frat brothers still weren't happy and started to shove him. "Hey," I shouted out, "that girl just had a smoke and nobody said a thing." One of the frat brothers, who was an upperclassman, turned around to see who was challenging them. He stood there for a moment and gave me a cryptic look. He then turned back and told the dude to go outside if he wanted to smoke. This evening, there was a large tub full of grain alcohol with purple Kool-Aid mixed in to cut it. I took a sip and grimaced. It felt like there was some soft hair in my mouth. I spit it out and stuck a finger in my mouth, fishing a small tuft of soft fur. I could feel my anger begin to rise as I pushed through the crowd to get at the tub. The chunk of ice had melted quite a bit now, and then I saw it. There in what was left of the ice was a frozen kitten. "What the heck?" I shouted as my anger continued to grow. A pledge was standing beside me and said, "Cool, huh?" as he laughed. I could not help myself as I made a hard fist and punched him in the face as hard as I could. At that point, I blacked out from the rage. When I came to it again, I was standing out in the yard. There were cops everywhere. It's no secret the local police there didn't like any of the fraternities. I watched in silence as cops were placing some of the handcuffed frat boys in the back of the squad cars. There was an older policeman standing beside me, and he told me to leave, which I immediately did. Later in the month, the fraternity lost their charter. Sometimes I'd see some of the ex-frat members at other parties. They'd like to give me mean looks, and one named Roger once started a trash talk, but as soon as I approached them, they left.